just going to grab this.
Okay.
That's fine.
All right.
Just take a moment to kind of...
Don't forget to get that light on me.
Yeah, I'll get the light so that then you can start.
Oh, everybody can see me now. My name, I'm known as Auntie Ellie Golding, and I'm a Biripi woman from the north coast of New South Wales. Grew up a little Aboriginal mission 2 miles outside of the town of Taree, called Purfleet, which means long grass, where us kids used to play in the long grass there, even playing hide and seek and then running into one another and hurting ourselves with our foreheads. But grew up as a nappy child there, a family of 8. There was 4 girls, 4 boys. I was the second baby, and Mum and Dad. My daddy was a very strong, intelligent man. He fought in World War I in Gallipoli, 1914-18. And my mother was a victim of the stolen generation. She was an ex-Cootamundra girl, which was very sad and robbed her of a lot of stuff, of a lot of things in her life, and took her away from her mother when she was 8 years old. And she had to leave Cootamundra homes. They opened the doorway for her in that home when she was about 16 years old to make her go out and work. She didn't know which way to go outside that door of that home, left, right, or where, because she was taken when she was 8 years old. So growing up with big family, Mum and Dad, as a child, I often watched my mum and dad. I loved both my mum and dad. But then I seen the strength more in my daddy. And I was getting taught with my culture and my Aboriginal spirituality by my dad. He also taught my mum, because she was robbed of that as well, with their teaching of her culture and her spirituality. So it was my father that I leaned on for strength. So one day he wanted to teach us all about our culture and our strength and our identity. So he done a black box and a white box, taught us all about our culture and spirituality in the black box, taught us all about who we were, our belonging. Never forget who we are, proud Aboriginal people. We were the First Nation in this land. And when he said one day to me, he said, "Look, my daughter, one of these days you're going to open the box to that open the door to that black box, and you're going to go out, and you're going to open the door of the white box, where you're going to experience different things than this black box. The black box, your spirit was free. This black box, you felt the love and you were loved." Very different in the white box. And I did experience started my journey in the white box. So different. As I got older, I couldn't go to school. My mum passed. She left us on her second stroke. So I didn't want to go to school without having my mother behind me and pushing me and encouraging me to go to school. I lost all that interest because of my loss of my mum. Dad tried to, but when he turned the age of 14, I left. He said to me, "Where are you leaving? When you leave this door, my daughter, I know I can't bring you back again, but when you leave this door, I'm not going to be your boss anymore. He's going to be your boss." and he was my boss, and he still is my boss. So in the white box, I experienced all the very, very bad things. Couldn't go to school because we were called, here comes the black niggers and the black dogs. I didn't want to handle any of that. I didn't want to be called that. I'm Aboriginal. I have a culture. I know my deep depth of my spirituality. Why should I be called all this? I didn't want to go back to school. So I worked with 2 other Aboriginal girls, my cousins. Pea picking, bean picking, it's called seasonal work in Australia. Working in farms, picking peas and beans from 7 o'clock in the morning till 4 in the afternoon. Hard work, very hard work. But we was getting the money. The sky was my roof, the land was my bed, and I enjoyed every bit of it from the age of 15 to 20 years old. Go home to visit my father every time the season stopped, and go and visit my daddy and my younger sister. Take money home to them, put her off to school. She had a good education. I didn't, but I'd rather have done that for my younger sister. So I come home, every time I'd come home from seasons, I'd see a man sitting at my father's table who loved my daddy and respected my daddy. I asked him, who was he, Dad? Why is he always here when I come home every season? He said, this is Mr. Golding, Peter Golding from England. He took to me because he was a stowaway in this country, and I took him under my wing, and he had me for a father and respect me. I said, I know that. I can see that he respects you. I was looking at my younger sister, growing very beautiful, and thinking, Peter Golding, looking at my sister, he must like my sister. But yet, a couple of years after that, I married him. So we were married for 54 years, had 7 children, 29 grandchildren, and 37 and a half, the 38th nearly born this month, great-grandchildren, but I love them all. But then I had the opportunity for education to read to my kids in the primary school, my Aboriginal kids from the block, Redfern Aboriginal community. And then Linda came again, Linda Burney. She said, Auntie Ellie, we only have that 12 months fundings for someone to read to the class. She said, she turned up at the 12th month. She said, I'm sorry, finished. So she said, I have another job for you. I said, oh, the job, another job. She said, yes. She said, it's in the secondary school called Cleveland Street High School. And I went, oh, high school. I just managed to get through reading to little primary kids. But I took it on. I was there for a few years. I loved it. And every chance I can get is pick up a book, pencil and paper, and write like my children said, my son said, Mum, get an exercise book, I'll get you an exercise book and a pencil. Write every day what kind of day it was, who you spoke to. You went shopping, where'd you go shopping, what did you buy, all this. Day-to-day journal I had all those years, and those few years working in Cleveland Street High School. Met my lovely friend who's over nearly 40 years sitting in the front row here. She was an art teacher there then, Jenny. Hi, Jen. And so that was a doorway. Avenues opened up for me in that school. They wanted Peter's ringing for people, Aboriginal people who do welcome or acknowledgement to country. That was right up onto this alley. And so Dreamtime Storyteller, which is my pride and joy. I am a Dreamtime Storyteller. I've been there through all that journey of mine, right back until the 1980s, right up until right now. I'm still a Dreamtime Storyteller. But as I said, that school opened a lot of doorways for me. Even got me to Canada to talk over there about my Aboriginal spirituality and my culture. Even went to New Zealand, went to England, And that took me everywhere. Even got me to meet some high-profiled dignitaries as well, the prime ministers, and also Queen Elizabeth twice. I met her and her husband, and also her daughter, Princess Anne, and even young William, Prince William, played billiards with him on the block in Redfern. So I got to meet all these people, and I always remembered my daddy. Whenever you have anything bad said to you or put down, always have in your mind, my daughter, think of who you are. Have that pride and that dignity within you always. And I'll say right now, I did have it, and I still have it, the pride of being an Aboriginal. So thanks for having me here tonight. And I think I locked the bag. Oh, here. I've got it. And as I said, I'd done welcome to countries and stuff like that. That is another pride for me. And I just read this to you now. As I said, I read now. I lose words now. But it's got here, I want to acknowledge, pay my respects to my elders from the Bidjigal and Gadigal homeland, past and present. Our tradition custodians never gave up on their land that was taken from them without their consent. Cared for the plants, animals, and for the environment as a whole. Our people were treated badly and ignored. We survived. It's here proved today. We have survived. We are still here. This land, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And we're still here because of the custodians that survived way back there in the invasion, when they passed down to generation of our culture and our spirituality. And it's landed down to us. It's up to us now to pass it down to our generation. Even with the voting, didn't do any good, but we're still passing that down to our generation with our strength of our spirituality and our culture. And we're just going to keep on keeping on and walking together with all those. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Auntie Ellie. It's really lovely to hear your story and to share your passion and your acknowledgement of country. I too would like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Sharon Berger. I'm the Events and Partnership Manager at +61J Media, and I'd like to welcome you all, both those here in person and those online, joining us for the 2023 Colin Tatz Oration. +61J Media, for those of you who don't know, provides an independent voice on Australia, Israel and the Jewish world. And our vision is to create an informed, engaged, diverse and socially aware Jewish community. The need for this seems more necessary than ever in light of recent events in the Middle East. And I'd like to take a minute to acknowledge the suffering and pain that is happening in the region and that many people are experiencing personally. And thank you for coming tonight despite everything that's going on and all the awful news that's coming from Israel and Gaza. Make sure you're subscribing to our bi-weekly newsletter for the latest insights on and analysis from everything that's happening. When Plus 61J Media began in 2015, we established a panel of experts to advise us, and the first and most senior member of that panel was Professor Colin Tatz, AO. While I did not know Colin personally, I am told he was always available with wisdom and good counsel, as well as contributing insightful articles. It is an honor for us to be able to remember him with this annual oration, which we have held since 2020. We'd like to thank Colin's family for giving us this opportunity to do so. Speaking of Colin's family, shortly I'll call on Simon Tatz, his son, to share a few words about his father and his legacy. But before I introduce Simon, it's my privilege to say a few words about Dr. Ann Summers, AO. Where to begin? Ann's bio is extensive, and I don't expect to do real justice to her slew of accomplishments, but I will try. She's a journalist, commentator, best-selling author. She's been an activist in the women's movement since its inception, and already in 1974 was working to establish modern shelters for women and children escaping domestic violence. Anne has advised Prime Ministers Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, run the Office of the Status of Women, been the Canberra bureau chief of the AFR newspaper, editor-in-chief of America's leading feminist magazine, Miss, editor of Good Weekend, chair of the board of Greenpeace International, Greenpeace International, and a trustee of the Powerhouse Museum. She was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia for her services to journalism and women in 1989, had her image on a postage stamp as an Australian legend in 2011, and in 2017 was inducted into the Australian Media Hall of Fame. Currently, she's a professor of domestic and family violence at UTS Business School. Her recent report, The Choice, Violence or Poverty, used previously unpublished data to reveal the far greater prevalence of domestic violence than was previously known. I'm sure you'll all agree she's eminently qualified to discuss the issue of gender equity and equality, and we look forward to hearing her speak on such an important topic shortly. There will be time for your questions after she's spoken, so please, I encourage you to take advantage of that opportunity. But first, I'd like to introduce Simon, who's going to share a few words about the late Colin Tatz. Simon is a public health policy expert who's held senior positions in the Australian Labor Party and Greens Party, including Chief of Staff to the Minister for Education and Senior Health Advisor. He was Director of Communications for Mental Health Australia and Director of Public Health for the Australian Medical Association. With his father, Simon co-authored The Seal Box of Suicide, The Context of Self-Death. Simon is currently the General Manager of Policy and Government Relations for the Australian Physiotherapy Association. Would you please join me in welcoming Simon? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very hard acts to follow. Thank you. I'd just like to begin by thanking Plus 61J, particularly Alona Lee and everyone involved in this. And I'd like to acknowledge the Tatz family here today, Sandra Tatz, Pam Tatz, Paul, Maya, Hannah, their families, and my sister Karen, who isn't here, and my extended family. I've been asked to say just a few brief words about my father, Professor Colin Tatz. I spent a bit of time thinking about how best I could describe Colin to those of you who didn't know him. The first thing I wanted to say is I never had a father or a dad. I had Col or Colin. Sometimes Zeta, which is the Yiddish word for grandfather. It was always Colin, and that's how we knew him. Colin had a lot of attributes, and there was a lot of ways I could describe him. I was trying to think of how I would portray this person to those of you who didn't know him, and I was thinking of words like seeker or what was the word, and the other night it hit me that the word to describe Colin Tatz was curious. Colin had an insatiable and driving curiosity, an eagerness to learn, and an eagerness to pass that learning on to other people. From what I know of my parents when they left South Africa, arrived in Australia, Colin became incredibly curious about the treatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. His PhD was, he told me, partly trying to understand how this wonderful, welcoming, beautiful country, we look out here today and we see all the beauty in Australia, but could also be aberrant and racist, and in some ways worse than the apartheid regime he and Sandra fled from. Colin devoted his life and his legacy to enhancing the lives of Aboriginal people. Colin was really curious about death. I say that with some sort of smile, but my father was very, very occupied about death. He wanted to know, he wanted to investigate, he wanted to inquire, he wanted to comprehend the psyche and the society that gave rise to the Holocaust and to genocide. I never asked Colin about this, and I wish I had. It's one of those conversations you have that I wish I had asked him. But when I read his books and his articles and I think of this, I think he was curious to explain how we die. Once when we were talking about the Holocaust, Colin said to me that every human action has to be explainable and representable. We must be able to describe in detail what we do to ourselves and what we do to others. So Colin became curious about self-death and understanding suicide. We wrote a book together, and I was rewarded in spending a few years with my dad just delving into death and suicide in all its historical, philosophical, cultural and mental health connotations. Suicide fascinated Colin Tatz. He wanted to learn about it, he wanted to know about it, he wanted to understand self-death, and he left a legacy of a very challenging book that confronts many of the myths about the sealed box of suicide. Death, as I said, was a curiosity to Colin. He loved crime books, he loved cop shows, and he loved really bad crime movies. As a kid, I used to buy those magazines, I don't know if you still get them at the newsagents, of the monthly magazines about famous murderers and killers, and he'd love poring over them with me. When he passed on, I inherited his many books on poisonings, and plagues, on mass murder, and coroners. My dad loved coroners. He loved coronial shows and coronial investigations. And I think perhaps in another life he wanted to be a coroner. But as much as death occupied my family upbringing, and I used to joke to my friends that I had this very loving, close, funny family full of death, but his curiosity about death was matched by a curiosity about life. Colin was incredibly curious about many things. One of them was music. He had an interest in music that he shared with his family. He loved going to concerts, he loved listening to music, but listening in a really deeply intellectually and emotional way. And I think he passed that on to his children. And one of the reasons I think is, like the rest of the family, he can't play a musical instrument. But music, he was curious about music in this really deep way. It wasn't just about listening to music, it was more than that. And I love the fact my dad had this little notebook in which he'd write down all the CDs he had with the composers and the orchestras and things, so he knew when he went shopping what he had and what he didn't have. And I love that curiosity that I think my brother and I have inherited. Colin was also very curious about sport. He wasn't curious about who won what and the results on sport. He was curious about the role sport played in society, about sport and culture, and mostly about sport as a vehicle for improving the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And with my brother Paul, he wrote many landmark and groundbreaking books about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sport that's changed people's lives. For most of my life, Colin Tatz was very curious, but I think he was more obsessed with golf. He was curious about golf swings, about club weights, about the thickness of grips, about putters. I grew up in a family of never-ending putters and golf clubs. He was especially curious about food and wine, and good food and wine. And this is something in our family that we shared, is a love and curiosity about food. Strangely enough, when I was thinking about what to say, the only thing my father wasn't curious about was vegetables. He had no curiosity at all about vegetables, although one night we cooked him dinner, my wife and I, and he discovered that green papaya salad was actually a green fruit vegetable, and he became quite excited and curious about this world of fruit and vegetables that he'd never had. But I wanted to say that this Colin's curiosity, and the reason I think we have the Oration, wasn't to be self-informed just to know things and to be a know-it-all. His curiosity so that he could teach other people and spark their curiosity and interest. One thing about Colin Tatz, for those of you who studied or knew him as a professor, he couldn't abide mental laziness. He pushed in curious students. He was demanding on friends, family and colleagues. He was demanding of us as children, and when I'd ask Colin things, he would usually say, look it up, go find it out for yourself, and if you still don't know, come back. But he really had no time for people who were incurious or lazy or uninterested in life. One of the things I did want to say briefly before we pass to Anne is His curiosity and his seriousness was also offset or counterweighted by an incredible curiosity about humour. My father had a great laugh, a wondrous laugh, and his face lit up, but he was also curious about humour. He would take me to, my brother and sister, to Woody Allen films, Sandra, to Woody Allen films and Mel Brooks films, long before I knew what they were about or how funny they were. He would, whether it was S.J. Perlman or otherwise, he was always curious about humour, not smutty humour or things like that, but great humour, and that was very much part of our life. And I thought I'd leave you just briefly to get an understanding of Colin Tatz. It was about our upbringing. So when we were young, we were a little bit more religious than we are now, and we'd have a Shabbat dinner on a Friday night, and the door was always open, and many visitors came to our house to enjoy the food. The food, I should point out, that Sandra usually cooked and Colin would feed under the table to the dogs, because his curiosity to life went to animals and to our dogs. And the dinner table was always a learning experience. We'd get a history lesson, we'd get a political lesson. We'd learn all about Jews Colin didn't like. We'd learn about the academics who were lazy and not very good, and those that were good. We'd hear about students that were good or wouldn't be good. So we had this dinner table that was like a mini lesson in life each night, each Friday night. And then when we grew up, the Friday night dinner was followed, for those of you who are old enough, I'm sorry for those of you who are young, on ABC in Armidale we had 2 TV stations, and on ABC we'd get the 2 Ronnies and Dave Allen at large, which was great laughter and humour. And then my brother Paul and my dad would sit there and watch Pot Black in all seriousness with his curiosity about snooker and about sport. So I thought it was very fitting that an oration that Plus 61J has put on is to honour what I would call a very curious man, a man of immense intellect and an infinite capacity to learn and an infinite capacity to teach other people. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see such a... Oh, it's even better. Excuse me. Wonderful to see such a great crowd here tonight. And I say I'm very proud and honoured that you have taken the time to turn out. So I wanted to acknowledge the members of the Tatz family. I didn't know quite just how many there would be here. And I'm very pleased to have had this introduction to Colin Tatz from his son, because I never met Colin Tatz, which I'll speak about in a moment. But first of all, I just want to say I'm honoured by the Plus 61J media that they would consider me as a suitable candidate to deliver this oration. And I'd especially like to thank Michael Visanti for his persistence in pinning me down to accept the invitation. I didn't ever meet Colin Tatz, more the result of geographical distance than political or ideological differences. I was a student in Adelaide and he was a teacher in Melbourne and later Armidale. By the time he arrived at Macquarie, and I had been living in Sydney, I was living in Canberra and then in New York, so there was no opportunity for our paths to cross. But of course I knew about him and his work, though not quite as much as I've just learnt from his son. Knew him to be one of the good guys when it came to the issues I cared about. His own passions, of course, as we've heard, were Australian Aborigines, about whom he wrote many books, sport and Aborigines in sport, as well as the topic of genocide. These interests, no doubt, reflected his personal history of having emigrated from South Africa, and it was his great gift to Australia that he researched and wrote so perceptively and with such fervour on topics that continue to need our urgent attention. Following his death at the age of 84 in 2019, the CEO of the Sydney Jewish Museum, Norman Seligman, noted that Tatz had played an important role in the museum's programs, conducting many seminars and workshops. All his endeavours were, he said, infused by his passionate quest for tikkun olam, for a just and fairer society resting on democratic values, social justice and human rights. Following the dismal results of the recent referendum on The Voice, many of us are feeling not only upset, but pessimistic about the future of race relations in this country. So it was interesting while researching Tatz's work to come across this comment in an article he wrote about The Voice in 2017 in The Conversation, where he asked, what new administrative creature lurches towards Canberra in 2018 or 2019? If it is to have no executive, political and financial authority, he wrote, and if its decisions have to be wise and logical in government eyes, then are we in for another expensive and doomed document? We will never know what stance he would have taken on the 2023 government referendum, but it is difficult to imagine that he would have been happy with a massive no vote. I can find no evidence that Colin Tatz, despite his very broad interest and wide curiosity, I'm not sure that included any interest in women's issues and the subjects that I'm going to be addressing tonight. But he had at least read Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook, which was something of a Bible for we women's liberationists in the 1970s. Even though the book had been published in 1962, it spoke with remarkable prescience to the issues of independence and freedom that the women of my generation aspired to. I suspect, however, that Tatz was more likely to be interested in Lessing's views on race relations in Rhodesia than he was in her feminism. Even so, I hope that he would be interested... wasn't me. Even so, I hope he would be interested in the quandaries and struggles that we continue to have in achieving the independence and freedom that Lessing's female characters yearned for. The advertised title of my talk, From Liberation to Equity, is of course an abbreviation. The full title is From Women's Liberation to Gender Equity, with the words women and gender doing the heavy lifting in a way that revolution and equity perhaps could not. What I want to explore this evening is how and why we have landed on this dilution of the description of what we women want. Have we become less ambitious, or are we just adjusting to reality? Does anyone even talk about liberation anymore? In 50 years, we have gone from demanding women's liberation to asking for gender equity, from insisting on free 24-hour childcare and abortion on demand, to fretting about unconscious bias and outdated gender norms. Not that these are not worth complaining about, but have we lost our anger and our outrage? Have we lost our passion? Are we being too polite, to steal a phrase from the famous Glenn Tomasetti song and title of Wendy McCarthy's recent memoir, Don't Be Too Polite, Girls? Is equity too tame an ambition when once we wanted liberation? Or does it, paradoxically, set a more accurate pathway to dealing with the unfinished business of the second wave of feminism? Let's remember our basic demands, that we control our bodies and that we are economically independent. This is the conversation we need to be having still, because we are not there yet. In many respects, we might be going backwards, and that is both alarming and dangerous for women. In the past 50 years, a lot has changed for women. There are no longer legal impediments to any ambition we might harbour. We have very high levels of education in this country. There are few jobs we cannot aspire to, even if we might have trouble getting some of them. The lives of women of my generation are infinitely better than those of my mothers, let alone my grandmothers. Surely we have made good progress, and yet. Our employment rate is not only lower than men's is, it is lower than women's was 20 years ago. As of February 2023, data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the ABS, indicates that men's workforce participation is at 71.2%, compared to 62.2% for women. 20 years ago, women's participation rate was 66.1%. We persist in having the highest rate of part-time employment in the OECD. No matter our age, fewer than 50% of those of us who are in employment work full-time. We are paid 22.8% less than men, according to the latest figures from the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. Many women spend their entire salaries on childcare. We retire with less superannuation. And, as we read constantly in the news, women aged over 50 are at greater risk of homelessness than any other group. So when it comes to our economic situation, women are a long way from achieving what we used to call women's equality, let alone gender equity. Now, in case you're wondering what the difference between equality and equity is, according to the Australian Human Rights Commission, equality is recognising that as human beings, we all have the same value. This means we should all have the same rights. Legally in Australia, we are entitled to be treated equally. Equity, on the other hand, is about achieving equal outcomes. It means taking into account of the fact that we don't all start from the same place and that sometimes we need to be treated differently in order to enjoy equality. The recently released report of the federal government's Women's Economic Equality Task Force, WEET is its acronym, has estimated, according to its chair, Sam Mostyn, that the value of the Australian economy would increase by $128 billion if the persistent and pervasive barriers to women's full and equal participation in economic equality were removed. In other words, although the task force used the word equality in its own title, its recommendations were all about equity, about what needs to be done to give women a chance at equality. It's startling that in 2023 we still need to be having this conversation. You would think that women's employment would be one of the easier issues to address and reform. Isn't it totally straightforward? Enable women to take any job for which they're qualified, pay them the same as men doing that or comparable work, make childcare accessible and affordable, and ensure that women don't suffer financially when they take time off the workforce to have babies. How simple is that? Well, not as simple as it turns out, and I want to spend some time examining just why this is the case. Back in the 1970s, before we realised just how complex the fight would be and how hard the resistance, I think we would have been astonished by Sam Mostyn's finding. Even though we railed against the patriarchy and male chauvinism, the term we used before sexism was invented, I think that we assumed that we could succeed. Our demands were reasonable. Well, maybe not free abortion on demand, but also we campaigned for jobs and equal pay. I remember one of the first actions of the women's liberation movement in Adelaide when we got started in 1969 was to march in support of equal pay for nurses. We were encouraged by some early victories to believe that if we had a good case, governments would respond. The Whitlam government came to power in 1972 and some of its earliest achievements were in response to our demands. Intervening in the Arbitration Commission to support the case for equal pay, removing the luxury tax on contraceptives, making the pill available on the PBS, funding family planning clinics and later women's refuges, health services and rape crisis centres, appointing women to key positions they'd never occupied before, setting precedents, giving us hope. For example, in December 1972, Whitlam appointed Elizabeth Evatt as the first female Deputy President of the Conciliation and Arbitration Commission, what had till then been an exclusively male institution. The Whitlam government did not last long enough to implement some of its promises, anti-discrimination legislation, for instance. But the Fraser government, despite its rhetoric and our fears, did not turn the clock back. He even advanced it in a key area by introducing family allowances. These payments were a radical redistribution from the wallet to the purse of the old child endowment, which used to be paid to the father. It now went straight into women's own bank accounts. We were allowed to have those by then, although we still could not borrow money without a male signatory, as I found out when I tried to buy a house in Canberra in 1980. The Hawke and Keating governments were even more responsive than Whitlam had been. We got the Sex Discrimination Act, albeit with some reservations that I will come to. Childcare was federally funded, although initially at just a meagre 30,000 places. And under Keating was made affordable via a tax rebate. And as I used to report in speeches I made while heading the Office of the Status of Women in the Hawke government in the mid-1980s, the pay gap was narrowing so fast that equal pay was simply a few years ahead. We were making progress. What we didn't realise was that progress was not the marker we thought it was. Nor did we fully understand the insidious forces lurking in the weeds, just waiting to subvert the gains we thought we had made. We were measuring progress, but we did not think about the bigger picture, about whether or not we were succeeding, not just as individuals, but as a sex, or as we would say today, a gender. Individual progress is not only not enough, it can be deceptive in making us think we are doing better than we actually are. This important distinction was laid out in a landmark speech in 2011 by Hillary Clinton when she was US Secretary of State in an address to the APEC Women and the Economy Summit. The meeting was held in San Francisco and was said to include the largest gathering of foreign diplomats to gather in that city since the founding of the United Nations 66 years earlier. As Secretary of State, Clinton was a great champion for women's economic progress. It is said that she required every desk officer in the State Department to know the fertility rate of every country they were responsible for. The fertility rate, of course, is an important measure of women's economic status. Generally speaking, the higher the fertility rate, the lower is women's economic status. In her speech to the APEC delegates, Clinton laid out the tremendous economic gains being made by women in many APEC countries. Then she said, "So, the promise is clear. What then is the problem? If women are already making such contributions to economic growth, why do we need a major realignment in our thinking, our markets and our policies? Why do we need to issue a declaration from this summit? Well, because evidence of progress is not evidence of success." She was referring to the uneven rates of development in different countries. Women were not progressing everywhere, so success could not be claimed. And she pointed to the benefits that would follow if women had greater access to the economy. The World Bank finds, Clinton said, that by eliminating discrimination against female workers and managers, managers could significantly increase productivity per worker by 25 to 40%. Reducing barriers preventing women from working in certain sectors would lower the productivity gap between male and female workers by a third to one half across a range of countries. It didn't happen. Despite the advocacy of the most powerful woman in the world, from the most powerful nation on earth, despite the palpable economic benefits for whole nations that would have followed, it didn't happen then, and it's still not happening now, as was attested to by the very similar remarks made by Sam Mostyn in her report when she calculated the Australian economy would benefit to the tune of $128 billion if barriers to women's participation were removed. So we have to ask ourselves, why? Why are nations not acting in their self-interest by opening up opportunities for women and thus growing their economies to the benefit of all? What is stopping them? In particular, why is Australia so recalcitrant? We who used to have such stellar record in improving wages and conditions for workers, well, for male workers at least, why are we so behind today? Well, partly it is the result of government policies. Even the well-intentioned ones sometimes have unforeseen consequences, or let's hope they were unforeseen. In 1983, the Australian government ratified the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known as CEDAW, which provided an international legal basis for the groundbreaking Sex Discrimination Act, which was introduced in 1973 and enacted on the 1st of August 1984. But in ratifying CEDAW, the government insisted on two reservations, i.e. notifying the UN that there were two provisions in the convention that it intended to disregard. These two reservations were in respect of women in the armed forces and paid maternity leave. Both these reservations were to have a detrimental effect on women's employment, making them at odds with the underlying intention of the Act itself. Australia, along with the United States, were the only two countries then that refused to legislate for paid maternity leave, as it was then called. This meant that women lost income for the period they were out of the workforce after having a baby. I do not have the figures to hand as to how many women this affected, but we can be sure that it was many thousands. And it was worse than just losing a salary. For the 3 to 6 or 9 months they opted to take leave for, women also lost seniority. They fell behind their male colleagues in superannuation as their employer was not bound to contribute for an employee who was not actually receiving salary, and in far too many cases, and in total breach of the law, many women were fired during their maternity leave. This still happens today. I know several women, each of them in senior executive positions, whose jobs were abolished while they were on what is now paid parental leave, effectively sacking them. The Armed Forces Reservation had an equally negative impact on women's employment. The Sex Discrimination Act required the Defence Department to abolish the Special Women's Services, the RANs, the RACs, etc., and to integrate women into the General Armed Services. The Cabinet agreed to Defence's supplication that women only be allowed to serve in jobs that were not combat or combat related. It turned out there were 17,500 job classifications in total in the Armed Forces, and I was on the IDC, the Interdepartmental Committee, in fact I chaired it, that had to go through every single one of those job classifications to determine whether the job was combat or combat related or whether women could be allowed to apply for it. You would be amazed at how many defence jobs were combat related. Women could not even be employed as cooks in the army, just in case the kitchen had to be deployed near a combat zone. Not remotely possible in 1986, you'd have to say. By the time we'd finished, there were fewer jobs for women in the Armed Forces than there had been available than in the separate women's services. So much for ending discrimination. There were other forces lining up to keep women out of employment or to make it as difficult as possible for them to have jobs. One of the arguments I had to contend with when I ran the Office of the Status of Women was that married women were taking the jobs of teenage boys and therefore had to be stopped. Given that Australia had, and still has, one of the most gender-segregated workforces in the world, this was a risible suggestion without any basis in fact whatsoever. But that did not stop employers from mounting campaigns and throwing up roadblocks for women. But the most surprising and the most formidable opposition we faced in trying to improve women's economic opportunities came from within the bureaucracy and, worse, the Cabinet itself. One of the biggest battles was around a tax deduction that was called the Dependent Spouse Rebate. I'm sure some of you remember it, and which we women fervently opposed because it was in fact a monetary reward to men whose wives did not work. Each year during the budget process we tried to get it abolished. It would have saved a lot of money as well as removing an obstacle to women entering employment. Every year our proposals were blocked, not by the federal opposition, but by the highest levels of the bureaucracy. In those days, all but one of them were men, and in every single case, their wives did not work outside the home. Talk about self-interest overcoming the requirement, then, for public servants to give impartial advice. But it was the federal Cabinet itself that was the most frustrating and disappointing opponent. When the Prime Minister Hawke announced in the 1984 election policy speech that he would fund 30,000 childcare places, there was uproar from several of his Cabinet colleagues because this policy had not been presented to Cabinet in advance. One minister in particular, the Minister for Finance, made it his life's purpose to get the policy cancelled. He did not succeed altogether, but he got it cut back very substantially, again with implications for women who could not take jobs unless they could find childcare. The same minister refused to fund the agency that would administer the new affirmative action laws that were designed to encourage employers to hire more women. He was eventually overruled by the PM, but not without a long and bitter and time-wasting fight that revealed the depths of antagonism to women working among some of Bob Hawke's senior colleagues. But if we thought things were difficult then, we had no idea what was in store for us when John Howard was elected in 1996. It was Howard that broke us, destroyed our politics, and I would argue fractured us irretrievably as a country. We had the evidence of his impact on multicultural and race politics on October 14. When it came to women working, Howard was determined to turn back the clock and to ruthlessly enforce his white picket fence view of where he thought women belonged. I've written a whole book about the details of the destruction Howard wrought, so tonight I'll just outline a couple of the most egregious and damaging. First, Howard dismantled the institutional structures designed to advocate for women's employment. He shut down the Women's Bureau that had been established in 1963 by his political mentor Bob Menzies to track women's employment, especially equal pay. The Sex Discrimination Commissioner was forced out of her job to be replaced by Howard's buddy Prue Gowd, and the Office of the Status of Women had its budget and reputation slashed. Howard then set about his agenda of making it financially difficult, if not impossible, for mothers to work. He abolished Keating's childcare tax rebate, he cut back spending on childcare, thereby reducing its availability. He made changes to the tax and family payment systems that ensured that women would effectively pay as much as 100% taxes on their earnings. It meant that two-income families were severely penalised. Who would want to stay in employment under these conditions? John Howard bragged about this. We've eliminated the bias that used to exist against single-income families, he said. We've effectively introduced income splitting. Howard's view was reinforced by Professor Peter MacDonald from the ANU, who said the overall bias in the new policies is in favour of pushing women out of employment. Putting it more graphically, MacDonald said, the largest payment that an Australian mother can obtain from government goes to those who leave the workforce at the birth of their first child and never return. Now, there have been some important changes since then. Gordon Bilney, the Labor Minister for Defence Personnel from 1990 to 1993, forced Defence to open up first combat-related and later combat jobs to women. There are few jobs in the military now that women are forbidden to apply for. It's just that the numbers who do apply are not very high, nor do they stay very long. I guess that's what years of discrimination and harassment produce, a workplace that not many people want to be part of. Jenny Macklin and Julia Gillard introduced a limited form of paid parental leave in 2011, allowing eligible mothers 14 weeks' pay on the minimum wage. The scheme was later, 12 years later, just last week, extended to include men further back than that, but 12 years later, the Albanese government extended it to 20 weeks with the intention to eventually make it 26 weeks. Welcome as these extensions are, the low rate of pay and the continued refusal to include superannuation means that taking this leave imposed a severe economic penalty on employed women. Subsequent governments have largely left in place the Howard tax and payments policies with their ongoing impact on making it uneconomic for women to work full-time or even work at all. This shows up in the high and growing figures for part-time work. We have to hope that the present government, the first Labor government since 2013, will try and right some of these wrongs. Setting up WEET was a positive first step, but its recommendations need to be adopted if we are to see any actual change. But, unfortunately, it's not just tax policies, childcare policies, PPL policies and the gender pay gap that are keeping women out of the workforce. It's also individuals, almost exclusively men, and they are using violence to do so. As already mentioned, Australia's overall participation rate is 62.1%. My report, The Choice, which was referred to in the introduction, found that 50.8% of the single mothers who were in my study were not working at the time of the violence. That's a 12% difference. A further 15.2% took time off work while they're experiencing violence. This is a disturbing and deeply under-researched phenomenon. We know from the ABS Personal Safety Survey in 2016 that 87.7% of the 62% of women who work, either full-time or part-time, had experienced previous partner violence in the past 12 months. We just don't know much about that experience or its consequences. Did they leave their jobs because of it? Did they reduce their hours and consequently their earnings? My current research entails using data from the Australian Longitudinal Study on Women's Health and HILDA to try to document the impact of this violence on women's employment. We have only just got started and have no results to share with you yet, but hope to have early in the new year. But I find it bewildering that there is practically no work on this topic because it has such severe consequences for the women involved as well as for society. We claim to be concerned about the extent and severity of domestic violence in this country, and yet we pretty much ignore these women and the impact this violence is having on their economic as well as their physical and not to mention psychological well-being. There are at least two ways in which violence can impact on women's employment. A woman can be actively prevented from working by her partner. That is financial abuse, a form of domestic violence. Analysis by Deloitte Access Economics puts the number at 70,300 of women who were prevented by their partner from working in 2020. And in the same year, 86,300 women had their income controlled or completely withheld by their partner. In addition, many women who are experiencing violence at home find it difficult to continue working. They may have physical injuries that are disfiguring or embarrassing. They may find it difficult to be punctual or to concentrate on their work, often because their partner is harassing them at work via phone or text, or even making physical appearance. Many women are physically and emotionally exhausted and simply cannot continue to work, even more so when their earnings are confiscated by their partner and they cannot enjoy any kind of economic benefit from their labour. We do not yet have the numbers of women who have left their jobs for these reasons, but we hope to be able to obtain them. And I regard this as an urgent and important contribution to the task of reducing violence against women in this country. To conclude, I'd like to return to Hillary Clinton's observation and say that we cannot talk of progress, let alone success, when it comes to violence against women. In fact, this violence may well turn out to be the barometer of our success in achieving gender equality. It is a far more integral measure of our progress than we had previously imagined. Violence against women is now firmly on the political agenda of federal, state and territory governments in a way that would have been unimaginable 30 years ago. Indeed, when I worked for Paul Keating as Prime Minister in 1992, and our research started showing us that women considered domestic violence as the issue they cared most about and wanted the government to act on, we were shocked. We also had no idea what to do. It was a state issue, we thought. But that was not good enough. Women across Australia were demanding that we do something, and they still are. We women's liberationists were slow to understand how critical an issue it was. It was not until 1974, a full 5 years after we burst onto the political scene, that we confronted the violence that many of us had experienced in our own lives, the rapes, the assaults, the beatings, and realised that no issue exemplified the personal is political more than violence against women. Once we'd had that light bulb moment, we jumped in, feet first, and took radical steps to at least try to help women who had been subjected to such violence. 1974 was the year we galvanised into action. We opened Elsie Women's Refuge in Glebe, Australia's first modern refuge for women and children escaping violence. We opened the Leichhardt Women's Health Centre, where women could go for non-judgmental medical treatment and advice on all matters, including the impacts of violence. And we opened the Sydney Rape Crisis Centre. Governments eventually responded by funding these services, although never adequately, and the battle for secure funding continues for Australia's estimated 800 women's refuges. But in addition, we now have our second national plan to end violence against women and children, 2022 to 2032, which has been signed onto by every government in Australia. It replaces the previous 10-year plan, which aimed to reduce, rather than end, violence against women. That plan was never evaluated, so we can't judge how effective it was, but as we look around us, we'd have to say it didn't do very much. The current plan outlines what needs to happen to achieve the vision of ending violence in one generation. So, okay, got that? 25 years, it's all going to be over. On paper, it looks good, or at least plausible, setting out the 4 domains or elements of the plan: prevention, early intervention, response, recovery and healing. That's it. But it is flawed in my view, for it stated assumption that we cannot end violence until we achieve gender equality. It should be the other way around. We have only to look at countries with greater gender equality than Australia, the Nordic countries, for example, to realise the fallacy of this assumption. Those countries all have much higher rates of domestic and family violence than Australia does. So what are we to do? If ever gender equity were needed in order to address a systemic issue that is costing women their safety, their health, including their mental health, and too often their very lives, and often their children's as well, then this is a potent example. Let's recall what we mean by gender equity. It's putting in place measures that will compensate for the barriers women experience in striving for equality. Hillary Clinton put it in terms of women's economic progress to help enrich nations. I think we need to expand that to consider the measures we need to put in place to prevent the various kinds of abuse that make up contemporary domestic and family violence. We need to recognise that domestic violence is no longer just or even mainly about physical violence anymore. The repertoire of forms of abuse available to perpetrators have become more extensive, more sophisticated, and immensely more cunning and calculated than the traditional notion of a single incident of physical violence directed against the woman. As a consequence, we need different strategies to address each of these different forms. We might have to recognise that different men employ different methods, or that some men start with apparently simple harassment but escalate quickly to far more serious forms of abuse. We need to know who these men are, and that means extending our focus and our research away from just concentrating on women and children, which is what we've been doing for the past 10 years, and looking also at the men who commit these crimes. The police, especially in Victoria, are already doing valuable work in this area, and I intend my project to be expanded next year to include trying to measure these men and their crimes. There is a lot riding on it, and I could talk about it all night, but I won't. But I hope that I have given you a flavour of the challenges we face, still now more than ever, to deliver on one of the two most basic demands of women's liberation, economic independence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was wonderful. I could feel my life flashing before my eyes because I lived through all those political periods and legislative changes. I've been a fan of Anne's ever since I read Damned Horse and God's Police, and I'm really grateful that you've given the address tonight. But I'm sure there are many questions. I actually can't see out there. Is there anything we can do with the light? Much better, much better. So, does anyone have any questions for Anne? Over here. There is a roving mic. Somebody, yeah. You need to push it on.
Testing. Testing. I'll speak loudly. Thank you for that presentation. It may seem naive, but I was actually wondering, what is it that men are trying to achieve? Is it just to keep women back, or what do you, from your research, what is it that men are seeking to achieve through domestic violence? Like, what's the outcome they're trying to achieve?
I think it's control. I think it's I think it's control. I think the most of the evidence that we see from all of the different kinds of violence point to the man feeling that he needs to control the behaviour of his partner and often his children as well. And why he feels this way is something that we can only speculate on, but this is why I think we need to do exactly what is driving this criminal and often murderous behaviour. But I mean, there is no other explanation. What else can you hope to gain from it? We could say revenge. I mean, there is a school of thought that says that resentment comes into it, particularly if a woman is economically more successful than he is. But there's equally evidence that says that women who earn more than their husbands actually suffer less domestic violence. So the jury's sort of out on that one.
I think the other question.
I'm very concerned about the fact that you're working so hard to deal with the current generation of men who are controllers. But I'm wondering, how are we going to start so that we change this from a very young age?
Well, I think there is a lot of work being done with young kids, particularly again in Victoria, where all the action seems to be following the Royal Commission they had down there and the extraordinary amount of money that's been invested in this by the former government. And they have a schools program called about respect. But I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to produce the results that we might hope for. And in the meantime, there's an awful lot to deal with with the behaviour of men who aren't in school. One of the things that I've just learned, I had a very interesting meeting with the Deputy Commissioner of Police in Victoria a couple of weeks ago, who's in charge of the enforcement of domestic and family violence, and she's a very keen observer of the changes, the ways in which violence is changing, and the changes in perpetrators. And what she says is that the perpetrators are getting younger, much younger, and that their targets include their parents, something that we used to see in any scale before, and that it's also becoming quite common for these young perpetrators to have several, they call them, I think, AFMs or something, but several families on the go at any one time. So that they've been in a relationship which is abusive, they've left or been kicked out, they go to another one, left and kicked out, and they might keep going back. They keep going back to the relationships and continuing to abuse the women and children. So I think it is actually quite urgent that we deal with those who are active now, as well as trying to teach a better behaviour of younger boys. But the evidence about the attitudes of young boys towards women are pretty scary. And I don't have them with me, but the recent there've been about 3 or 4 recent surveys that show that disturbing numbers of young men are, first of all, think we've either achieved gender equity and therefore it's all over, or we don't need it to bother about it, so we don't need to do anything anyway, or they have quite avowedly antagonistic attitudes towards women. And those attitudes seem to be getting worse amongst certain groups. So I don't quite know where this is coming from, but I think all this is very, very alarming, and it's urgent that we deal with it.
And thank you for your work. At the end of your speech, you mentioned that you are going to start to ask or measure the men. I'm really interested to hear how you're going to go about that, and I think it leads on from what you've just spoken about now. Thank you.
Well, it's not easy, of course. What we are hoping to do is to persuade the government to set up a new household survey, which would be longitudinal in character. At the moment, all of the information we have on domestic violence comes from something called the Personal Safety Survey, which is a cross-sectional survey, so we get a picture of what's happened at a particular point of time, but we have no idea what's happened before or afterwards. So we need longitudinal data, and if we'd set one up 10 years ago, we would be in a lot better place than we are now, but better late than never. But I'm hoping we can persuade the government to do this, and that as part of that questionnaire, we would be questioning men about their behaviour and and trying to find ways to persuade them to talk about their violence in a way that's documented, recorded and measurable.
Yeah.
It is done in other countries, it can be done.
Sorry, Anne. Hi, and thanks so much for what you're doing. I work with a lot of vulnerable women who get into difficult relationships. And the challenge really is that often when it's just coercive control or just financial control and it hasn't yet turned to violence, there's that fine line where, you know, what do we do between when you're seeing an unhealthy relationship, that there is power and control before it becomes physically violent. That's, and then also just if you can talk a little bit about the coercive control laws and how you feel that might help things or contribute to some change.
Well, it's always difficult to interfere in somebody else's relationship, but I think that certainly if it's somebody who's a member of your family or somebody close to you, I think you have to try and find a way. I think that it's one of the things about the... I mean, I'm not by any means an expert on the coercive control laws, which are either, you know, are progressively being introduced in every state at the moment, have already been introduced in New South Wales. We don't know how they're going to work. There's a lot of controversy about them. A lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are concerned that they'll be used against them because there is a tremendous propensity at the moment to misidentify perpetrators by the police and arrest the woman, not the man, and that these laws might make that easier. So that's a concern. The other concern is that in order to enforce these laws, is going to require massive retraining of the police. And a lot of this is causing resentment amongst the police. I mean, a lot of these people joined the police to, you know, cops and robbers and chase criminals and that sort of thing. They didn't join the police to spend 60% of their time on domestic violence, and they resent it. And that is an extremely difficult management issue for police forces. And I don't think the police force in this state is addressing that. I'm happy to prove wrong on that, but I don't think they are. But I mean, one of the things that stays with me is, you might remember a woman by the name of Hannah Clark, who was, with her 3 children, was burnt in Queensland 2 years ago, and it's because of her that we have all these coercive control laws. And I remember her parents gave an interview on television shortly after she died, and they said, look, we were aware of this behaviour, but we didn't realise how serious it was. And she used to say to us, I'm not a victim of domestic violence because he's never hit me. And I think this, you know, that it's up to families to recognise if they see behaviour like this, or if their child, their daughter or their sister or whoever complains that they're not allowed to see them, or they're not allowed to, you know, decide what clothes they wear when they go out, or that, you know, their behaviour is being controlled in other ways. You know, it's almost a duty to try and do something, because this can end up being a fatal situation.
I think we have a question over here, if somebody has a microphone.
Yes, I was wondering how much you think colonisation in Australia by a very hierarchical British kind of structure has created a more potential for domestic violence with men dominating women and humans dominating nature.
Well, I mean, the forms of violence might be influenced by our societal cultures, but we are not even close to having the worst rates of violence in the world. So I don't think that it's made us worse. It made us different in that way. It's not something I've really examined, so I can't really answer, but I think it's a very good question, something we should look at.
From a social ecology point of view, that's an argument that it's the domination of men over women and humans over nature that's creating a lot of the problems in the world today.
Well, that's true. That is definitely true, yeah.
Any other questions?
When you were talking about the police, that
Oh, hello. Yeah, to hunt criminals, and police forces are not really equipped to deal with proper investigation of domestic violence and all the subtleties of it. I wonder whether police forces are actually changing their recruitment to have more women, to have better education of their officers beforehand, to cope with the fact that this is going to occupy much more of their time in investigation. Is that happening anywhere in Australia or overseas?
I don't know that it is happening, but I do know that a lot of senior police think it should be happening. The police officer from Victoria that I mentioned before, that I had a meeting with recently, she's written a very interesting speech that she gave at a conference a couple of weeks ago, in which she said, I wish that a lot of the young women who want to help address the problem of domestic violence, instead of going to get a job in a refuge, I wish they'd join the police. And that's a kind of very interesting thought. But there's sort of huge cultural impediments there, because we think of the police, I mean, even we want the police to do the right thing. We do have ingrained notions about who police are and what they should be doing. And the cultural changes required are simply massive. And I don't think we've even started to take them on, but we need to.
There's a question back there.
Thank you so much for your address, Dr. Summers. That was absolutely fabulous. Could you comment on how you think apprehended violence orders and personal violence orders could be working better?
In a word, no. I'm sorry, it's not something I know anything about. I think the only thing I can say about it is I know that it took 17 years for them to become national in impact. That's sort of like the standard gauge railway. In this country, you can't do anything nationally easily. And so having an apprehended violence order that only works in one state, of course, is completely useless. But I really have, it's not something I've looked at, so I'm sorry, I can't say.
So I would like to ask you, you made a brief reference to the Albanese government extending leave provisions. I just wondered, do you think there's a political will now to improve the situation, the economic situation for women?
Well, I have to, of course, praise the Albanese government for the decision they made to increase payments for single mothers in the last budget. So I'm very, very happy about that, although I wish they'd extended it to the cut-off age of children to 16, not 14, and I hope they'll do that in the next budget. So they've been quite good in that respect, although I do think there has to be a total overhaul of the welfare system, because the amount of money that single pensioners get, parent pensioners get, is still way below the poverty line. When Whitlam introduced the Supporting Mothers benefit in 1973, it was the same level as the age pension, and that's what it should be. As to whether or not this government is serious about supporting women's economic independence, well, they declined to include superannuation in this latest paid parental leave package, and that's disappointing. We'll see how they respond to Sam Mostyn's report. There's a blueprint there for creating a very, very different world for women's employment if those recommendations were to be adopted. They had that report for more than 2 months before they released. They didn't want to release it during the Voice campaign, so they sat on it for a while. But now it's out there, but it hasn't been debated very much. There hasn't been much response to it, which is disappointing. I think the only way anything happens politically is massive pressure. So we have to make it impossible for them not to do it.
Very good.
I'm curious.
Last question.
I'm just curious in terms of equity or anything, professional young women today, how do they see the world in Australia?
You're asking me.
Yeah, well, yeah, we've had the historical context and we know what older women have contributed, but how do the young professional women see this? Are they passionate about change? Are they accepting what is? Are they less ambitious and more realistic?
I honestly can't answer that. I mean, I don't know. I wish I did know. I mean, I think there's no avenue for hearing their views that I'm aware of, unless you have friends in those age groups, and I do have I have a few, but I really don't know. I mean, there doesn't seem to be the fighting spirit around that there was, but I don't know. Young women, speak up. Yeah. Yeah.
So on behalf
someone's
of...
going to speak. This young woman's going to speak. No?
Yeah.
There she is.
I'm being given the wind up, but yes.
I'll be brief.
I'm a volunteer with my local police station. At the moment, I go to a local court with the domestic violence officer. Someone asked whether the recruits are specifically for that. They're short-staffed. There is one female who is a regular domestic violence officer. The other people are sometimes on a 3-month rotation, don't seem to know a great deal, don't seem to have a lot of training. There are 3 different police areas that are dealt with by this particular court. At least up to 30 AVOs and other aspects of domestic violence are being heard on those 3 different police areas on a Thursday. One day last week, one of the defendants was complaining, mostly the cases are for mention, for compliance, they're not, and for a hearing. She isn't hearing cases, she's just, people are coming and going and she's making these decisions. The other day, a defendant said, why do I have to wait till May for my hearing? And she said, if you're complaining, she said, I am too. She said, you write to your local MP and see what you can do. And that's the situation at the moment, I regret to say.
There is a young woman who's got the microphone there, so this is absolutely the last question.
I mean, I would say I went to an all-girls high school where, a really strong culture of pro-feminist approach to our careers and our life trajectory was really inculcated in my education in a government school. But looking at my friends and the households I interact with, I still feel like there are subtle cultural features of the way we interact with the opposite gender that result in households optimising their own circumstances in ways that are financially disadvantageous for the female, but financially advantageous for the whole household. So things like the fact that women continue to often date and marry older men means that the male in the household usually has the higher income, and when it comes time to take maternity leave or time out of the workforce, it's always economically smarter to keep the slightly older, more advanced in their career man in their job, and the woman takes time out of work. It's subtle things like that, the fact that we date older men who provide economic security, that mean that we are continuing to make these decisions against our own best interests, even though they benefit the household.
Have any comment to that? No. Thank you for that comment. Thank you for that comment.
Okay. On behalf of +61J, I'd like to thank all our speakers tonight, Auntie Ellie, who gave us such a beautiful acknowledgement of country, Simon Tatz, who gave us some wonderful insights into his father that I didn't know about, and to our guest speaker, Anne Summers, who's given us a wonderful address and has really carried on the ethos of time. Thank you all for coming. It's lovely to see you here, and we look forward to presenting you with another wonderful oration next year. But in the meantime, please subscribe +61J Media. Thank you.